few minutes before showtime, I sat down and I was looking through a story at the Politico. The Politico is not, and I want to point this out, is not a conservative publication. It is one of Washington's leading liberal rags. These are the same people back in 2008 who were accused of being in the tank for Barack Obama. In fact, by one of the editor's mothers, and his response was, "So what?" So they're not known as, well, they're opinion guys, like I am, but they're liberal opinion guys. There is a story at Politico this morning that says Democrats are glum, down in the dumps, upset. They're hurt. They feel they've blown another opportunity to steal a seat from the Republicans. Now, their candidate last night, John Ossoff, and I had a sound clip here, but I'm not able to locate it. He was being interviewed by, I believe it was Carol Costello at Clinton News Network yesterday, and she was greeting him with, "Hello, fellow traveler." Well, I may exaggerate that, but they were throwing him puffball questions, including the one about the fact that he doesn't live in the district. And then he mentioned, "Well, I've been living with my girlfriend for the last 10 years, a mile and a half outside the district." "Oh, well, when's the big day?" she asks. Well, you could have followed that up and said, "Yes, but you don't live in the district that you're running for, so when are you going to marry this girl and move back in the district?" That didn't happen. That didn't happen. And Democrats were assured that he was going to walk away with this thing because, well, all of the Hollywood elites in the New York Times said he would. It's nowhere near New York City. It's in suburban Atlanta, Georgia. It's nowhere near Hollywood. It's, again, in suburban Atlanta, Georgia. This guy Ossoff goes on stage last night because he didn't get that 50%. So he's going to have a runoff. Now, there were 11 Republicans out of 18 candidates and 4 Democrats who were in this race and a couple of independents. I was adding up. They were showing on television this morning the numbers that all of the Republicans, at least the top 4 Republicans got, and it was essentially the same percentage. Karen Handel got just under 20%. She was the second leading vote getter in this whole process. So she's a Republican. She's well known in the district. She's a former, I believe, Fulton County commissioner in Georgia. That's the county immediately around Atlanta. The district represents 3 counties, or covers 3 counties. She is known as a fiscal conservative. She does not govern on the county commission as a social conservative, although Eric Erickson, who's a talk show host in Atlanta, wrote this morning that he knows her personally, and in her personal life, she is a social conservative, but she doesn't govern that way. So she's just a fiscal hawk. Now it makes his job, that is Ossoff's job, much harder because he doesn't have this divided field. The top 4 Republican vote getters out of those 11 essentially tied him in the totals. That meant that another group of Republicans also got more votes. And if you counted up all of the Republican votes, the Republicans got more than he did. So the Democrats today, according to Politico, again, a liberal rag out of Washington, are licking their wounds and they're stymied because they just can't understand why the rest of America just can't accept their message. Bernie Sanders gave a speech in Kentucky last night and said the problem with his party, and Sanders is one of those guys, I think he's got a lot of strange ideas, but he's really, really honest. And he said the party is still plagued by the fact that the decisions are being made by people on both coasts who have no idea what middle America is like. Spot on, Bernie. Spot on when you make that assessment. Now, he may be the nominee for the Democrats for president coming up in 3 years. He'll only be 148 at the time, which tells you they don't have a very deep bench either. And this Ossoff guy, he's all of 30. He barely qualified to be in the, I think at 30 you can run for Senate. I think it's 25 for House of Representatives. So he beat the deadline for House of Representatives by a few years. He mentioned in his comments last night as he was talking to his backers, his supporters, that, well, we'll have to tee it up and do it all over again a few months from now. He's hoping he can maintain the enthusiasm, but it may be difficult, according to the Politico story, to keep Democrats enthusiastic about what they're doing because they thought they were going to win in Kansas last week and didn't. They thought they were going to win last night, and they didn't. And it only was revealed yesterday, and a lot of early votes were cast. Bob Beckel, who's a liberal, was saying this last night on the Fox 5. He was saying that a lot of early votes were cast, and those really early votes were cast by Democrats. But do you think if a lot of them had even known that he was a carpetbagger, that he didn't live in the district, that they would have said, I'm not so sure I'm going to vote for that guy? Georgia also, even though a lot of Democrats live there, is still a socially conservative place, and the guy's been living with a girlfriend for 10 years and hasn't married her. Now, maybe you don't think it's living in sin if you're a Democrat. Some Republicans don't even any longer think it's living in sin. But if you're living with a woman for 10 years, good golly, at some point you're going to propose, aren't you? Are you stringing her along? And I think that if a lot of Democrats had known he lived outside the district and why he lived outside the district, that some of them may have also turned away from him, and they may do it in the next round of electioneering. It shows you that they are still incredibly out of touch. This guy stood in front of the crowd last night and he said, well, this was a grassroots effort. No, it wasn't. They collected $8 million, mainly from Hollywood and New York City liberals. $8 million. Mike Simpson can run a campaign on a couple of $100,000. Now, he doesn't necessarily have a lot of stiff competition, but he can run a campaign on a couple of $100,000 and win a seat in Congress every 2 years. He collects a bit more than that, but he doesn't necessarily need to spend a lot of money. This guy, and he was one of 4 Democrats, had $8 million they blew through. $8 million from outside. And they still couldn't pull it off, which is why they're worried, because this Handel, she's well respected in the district. She's going to be much more formidable now that there aren't 18 candidates in the race. There are just 2. And I have this from the Resurgent. This is also Eric Erickson's publication out of Georgia. One of his colleagues, Sam Thomas. The headline is Pew. The Pew Research Center, again, is not a conservative think tank by any means. The headline is Pew, Americans don't like Democrats. Of course, you could spell that, I guess, in a couple of ways. Pew. We've got this. According to a poll released by Pew Research, a majority of Americans now view the Democratic Party unfavorably. About half, 51%. Now, that means Donald Trump right now is more popular than the Democrats. Media would tell you otherwise. We've got a short break. I want to pick up on this on the other side of the break in a couple of minutes. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310. KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Also coming up in the next hour of the program, we're going to have voices from both the Republican and Democrat side of the aisle in Boise talking about the grocery tax veto. That's in hour number 2 of Top Story. Just a quick note, I wanted to remind you, in fact, we may be doing a live show sometime soon at his store here in town. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. But I have been a participant in the Total Body Transformation System, and I was telling you that a couple of weeks ago, tape measurers showed that I dropped 4 inches alone off my neck during a course of about 5 months on this diet. People have been asking me a lot of questions about it around town. It's not some sort of fad diet. It is a healthy way to lose weight. And in fact, the meal replacement plan is often healthier than the meals you've been eating, and it costs about the same. You still, though, get a healthy amount of calories every day. And I wanted to point out, too, as well, this is a diet that is backed up by a brilliant scientific team from some of the leading research universities in the country, Columbia, Cornell, Tufts, and many other prestigious universities as well. The average participant will drop 22 pounds and lose 4 inches off their waist in just 60 days. And I wanted to point out as well, if you're going to be a participant, there is a 30-day full money-back guarantee. And the fellow who actually got me interested in this is Don Chandler, a longtime businessman here in Twin Falls. Don himself had lost in excess of 50 pounds on the diet. Don is available if you'd like to know more at this number, 208-731-3560. That's 208-731-3560. And Don, I'll tell you what, if you talk to him, he'll tell you that he feels like an entirely new person in the sense that he's got more energy, he looks great, and he's gone back to the workout club too. And he's showing off and showing up a lot of the very young folks who are there working out alongside him. And a quick mention too, speaking of health, Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine is on the way in just about 15 minutes. Dr. Tripp is going to talk to us today about skincare. You know, I saw an interesting story on Fox and Friends this morning about skincare. Just as an aside, I was amazed by this. If you're sleeping on a cotton pillowcase, and I suppose I am, I go out to the big box store and buy a pillowcase or bed sheets and pillowcases come in one package most of the time. Go out and buy them, and I come home and put them on the bed and on the pillows, and I don't think a lot about it, but I don't spend, I think, more than $20 on a set. You know, I'm a guy. I could probably sleep atop a pile of bottles and cans. Maybe I did back at college. I don't really worry about it. But if you're sleeping on cotton bed sheets, according to some latest research, it is drying out the skin on your face and will make you look much older. So the recommendation is spend a fortune on silk, like a James Bond movie, right? All of the villains, they're all wealthy. They have silk. And James Bond himself, who's on a government salary, somehow manages silk too as well. Yeah, but that's the recommendation, that if you switch to a silk pillowcase, your face will look younger. Who knew? 18 minutes after 8 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310. KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We're at 41. Can I tell you about the weather? Well, we all could move to Arizona, I suppose. We're going to have some sunshine this weekend, which is good because we have the big garage sale that's going on, the community garage sale out at the Twin Falls County Fairgrounds. That'll take place on Saturday. And unlike last year when I had to sit at the back door and, keep an eye on things, with the door open and it was about 38 and windy with the rain blowing in, it was very, very comfortable. This weekend the weekend days are going to be the best days we're going to have for the next couple of weeks. We'll have temperatures maybe in the mid 60s and mostly sunny skies, I would imagine. But then by the middle of next week, we're back into the stretch of temperatures where we're going to see high 40s to low 50s and rain a lot. Now, the rain isn't bad. It's going to be good in the spring or summer, but we're going to see a lot more of that. I just want to point out, too, weather is a service of Mountain Home Auto Ranch, which is located in Mountain Home. I was talking about this special election in Georgia and what you can interpret in all of this. This is from the Pew Research Center. About 51% of Americans have an unfavorable view of the Democrat Party, while 45% have a favorable view. In January, slightly more had a favorable than unfavorable view. 7 in 10 Democrats and Democrat-leaning independents now express a favorable view of their party. In other words, 70%. But that number in January was 82% and was 87% in October, and it's tumbling like a stone. There's a new book out about Hillary Clinton's campaign, and another liberal writer was saying this morning that it may have been the worst campaign in American political history. Now, I've seen some really bad. There was that guy Alvin Green a few years ago who accidentally won in a runoff election and got the nomination as a Democrat for U.S. Senate. I think it was North Carolina. And they figured out that voters really didn't know who the candidates were. Alvin, because of the A on his first name, was near the top of the ballot, and so people just pulled the name on the top of the ballot. That might have been the worst run campaign of all time because when they'd put cameras in front of him, he couldn't articulate his own name, much less any policy. And he ended up losing, which, hey, if you're a Republican, you're not upset by that. It's 20 minutes after 8 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. So for all of this talk that liberals just know it. They can't understand why Trump won. It must have been some bad, nefarious thing. Martians from outer space came down and forced people to vote for Trump. So they just knew that they were going to win in Kansas and mop up in Georgia last night, and it didn't happen. They're also telling you, the New York Times, Peter Beinart, there's a writer at the New York Times who claims in the last couple of days that support for Trump among his base is beginning to flag. That is, the people who voted for him are beginning to lose confidence and faith in him, and they feel in some cases Trump has turned his back upon them. That's from the New York Times, the Bible of American liberalism. But if you go over to the Christian Science Monitor, and I pulled down a lot of liberal sources today to make my point, the Christian Science Monitor is again among America's most liberal publications. This headline, Trump voters discontented with a question mark. So far, that's not what polls say. The New York Times tells you that they're discontented, but in this case, the New York Times is ignoring polling data. President Trump's, the writer says, rocky first months in office haven't much bothered his voters, but the guy can't help it. He's a liberal, he writes. In fact, I know this guy, Peter Greer. I've corresponded with him before via email. His second sentence is this, at least not yet. In other words, we hope, we hope, we hope. Then he goes on to write, yes, there have been lots of stories from Rust Belt areas about stirrings of discontent among the Trump faithful. But those are mostly anecdotal and so far data, meaning polls, don't back up the thesis. For instance, in a big new Pew Research survey, fully 92% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents say Mr. Trump has done as well or better than they expected. Only 7% say he's done worse. All the way down in paragraph 4 is this. What this means is that Trump's base remains intact. They could have put that up at the top. but they buried that down because, again, it's a liberal publication. There's an admission here, and it's got to be painful for them, that things are going better for Trump than the media and many of the other liberal lackeys around the country would try to tell you. In other words, they hope that you pay no attention to the actual science. See, they're telling you that everything else is settled science out there or settled law, but pay no attention to the polling data, which is scientific, because that's not what we like, and therefore it can't be true. There was a woman from Rasmussen reports this morning on Fox, and she was pointing out that Trump's approval rating just keeps going up and up and up over the last several weeks. And the last polls that they took were before some of the latest military actions, and they could go even higher on some of that. Now, as you know, I haven't really been big as an America Firster. I haven't been big on some of these military activities, but they aren't hurting the man when it comes to polling data. And even some Democrats are having a change of tune. Those who voted against him, some, obviously not a lot, but some are having a change of tune. You can badmouth Rasmussen because it's frequently working with Fox News, but Rasmussen, even some liberals have admitted, he has been able, going back to 2004, the presidential election, he's been generally the most accurate of the national pollsters. In fact, when everybody else in 2004 was saying John Kerry would rack up 311, I believe it was, electoral votes, and they were still saying it on Tuesday afternoon of Election Day, and then he got smoked. Rasmussen never said that. Again, it's people who are, their bias is affecting, it happens a lot in research. They've even seen people who aren't even aware they're doing it, but leaning on scales in some scientific studies because it will help them get the results they want, not necessarily the results that would be, well, the normal results if they didn't interfere with the research. And so you can go on with this, and then this is coming out of neighboring Nevada. The Secretary of State there says she has evidence of voter fraud in the presidential election, and it was not benefiting Donald Trump. I'm sure that this is going to get a lot of attention. Huffington Post did pick it up. Also another one of those liberal rags. Secretary of State Barbara, and I believe she pronounces the last name Sagofsky, wrote in a letter Friday to the Department of Motor Vehicles that DMV workers had been accepting voting applications from non-citizens and forwarding them to the Secretary of State's office. Sagofsky said she had no evidence she had evidence non-citizens voted in the presidential election, but didn't elaborate. Are we in any way surprised by this? Does anybody, and media has poo-pooed this, media poo-pooed the whole notion that perhaps the British were helping the Obama White House spy on Trump and his people. And then it turned out it looked like the British did indeed pass along evidence, and that indeed there were people surveilled. And then the media just pretends it didn't happen, or they crawl back into their hole and hope that you don't notice that we've learned that they're not telling us the truth. 826 now. Telephone number for reaching our show today, 736-0300. 736-0300. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and NewsRadio1310.com. It gets even worse for people in academia who don't follow the conventional wisdom. The Washington Examiner, the professor who predicted Trump would win, says nobody would talk to him around campus or around Washington, D.C. A professor who predicted Trump's victory detailed on Tuesday the treatment he received from peers after correctly forecasting the results. Alan Lichtman, distinguished professor of history at American University, was one of the only prominent figures last fall to accurately predict Hillary Clinton would lose to Donald Trump in the presidential election. Lichtman, who has correctly forecasted the winner of every election since 1984, continued, I'm at American University in the heart of liberal Washington, D.C., and nobody would talk to me. They'd make signs when they saw me coming. They'd protect themselves. He was getting nasty letters and emails asking him if he got his degree through mail order, as if somehow that would be bad, and people, or out of a box of Cracker Jacks, I suppose. And he was getting all of these nasty comments. And he wasn't endorsing Donald Trump. He was just saying, the models that I use and have accurately used for 3 decades and longer all say Trump is going to win this election. And that was too much for these people, for his colleagues and the other, Marxist-Leninists wandering around his campus and inside the Beltway. And they did everything they can to try and humiliate him. But he was right. He was right on this count. And again, you've got to ask, what's wrong with the groupthink of the American left? They think that everybody else out there is a liberal cross-dresser or wants to be. They are so far off the mark. If we have some time after our guests in the next hour, we're going to be joined by Brian Zollinger. He's a member of the Idaho House of Representatives from Idaho Falls, also a relative of the boss here in the building, I should point out. They didn't know that, but a rare last name, and yet they were able to put together that they're connected, families are connected. And then he'll spend about 15 minutes with us, and then we'll be joined for about a similar stretch of time by Michelle Stanich. She's probably the most powerful Democrat in the state, the leader of the Democrats in the state Senate. She'll join us and spend a few minutes. They're both talking about the governor's repeal of the grocery tax, and they're not happy about it. The repeal vote was vetoed by the governor. In other words, the tax stays. On the other hand, the Republicans, some, not all, some Republicans, such as Brian, are saying we need to file a suit and try to prove that the governor's veto came too late and that the law took effect. The Democrats aren't quite so sure they want to be involved in that, but there's rare agreement that this thing should not have been vetoed by members of both caucuses in the House and Senate in Boise. But when we're done with that, if we have a few minutes, so about 9:40 or so this morning, I wanted to address the story that's coming out of Boise, making national news. It's about a guy who thinks she's a woman, or it's a woman, or he's a woman, and says that the state will not allow him or her to change that birth certificate and some of the. Look, you can call yourself whatever you want. Nobody has an issue with that. There's a woman in Norway who calls herself a cat. She's not a cat. I think it's just performance art on her part. She calls herself a cat. But that doesn't mean everybody else has to recognize it. And this notion that they should because otherwise it hurts your feelings is a little bit ridiculous. All those things coming up a little later this morning on Top Story with Bill Colley on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. It's 40 at 8:30. Dr. Jonathan Tripp from Tripp Family Medicine scheduled to join us in just a few minutes.